Rome wasn't built in a day, but when it came to building a republic, they sure moved fast. By 509 BCE, tired of their king's shenanigans, the Romans overthrew their monarchy and set up shop as a republic. The Roman Republic lasted for nearly 500 years, helping to lay the foundations for many modern democratic ideas like shared power, or the rule of law, and systems of checks and balances. So let's get into how the Romans built this governmental skyscraper out of the Legos of political participation, aristocratic control, and whatever else they had lying around. First, let's start with the big dogs, the people who actually held the power. In ancient Rome, there were two big cheeses at the top of the food chain, the consuls. Each year, Roman citizens would vote to elect two consuls who would serve one-year terms as chief magistrates or executives of the state. The consuls wielded a lot of power, or imperium, which also extended to military command. And importantly, each consul had the power to block the other's actions. This created a system of checks and balances between the consuls and prevented any one person from becoming too powerful. But if the consuls were abusing their imperium, citizens could hold them accountable. After their term ended, this idea of shared power and public accountability was a pretty radical idea for the ancient world. Now, even though the consuls were the most powerful position in the government, they weren't exactly running the whole show. See, above the consuls and all other magistrates was the Roman Senate. Now, unlike the consuls, senators weren't elected. Instead, they were appointed to the Senate after serving in certain positions, usually as a magistrate. And as you can probably guess, given that most of these positions required wealth and privilege, the Roman Senate was pretty much made up of Rome's elite, or more specifically, its patricians, the aristocratic landowning class. The Senate wasn't a legislative body, meaning that they didn't make laws, but they did have a ton of power when it came to advising the magistrates, especially the consuls. The Senate debated issues, advised magistrates, and provided guidance on policy. And while they didn't write laws, they did issue senatus consulta, or advisory decrees that carried significant weight and were usually followed by the magistrates. To bypass the Senate, the magistrates had to go directly to the assemblies, which was definitely not their favorite thing to do because the Senate was really the true heart and brain of the Roman Republic. Sure, they weren't elected, but they were experienced, influential, and dedicated to the traditions of Rome. But wait, don't get too worried about those pesky plebeians just yet. We'll get to them soon. Now we've got to talk about the role of the people. So put your tinfoil hats back in the drawer and let's move on. The Roman Republic had several popular assemblies where Roman citizens could vote on laws, elect magistrates, and decide on matters of war and peace. Now, remember, only property-owning male citizens could vote, but that still included a decent chunk of Roman society, especially when you consider that Rome's population reached around 1 million by the end of the Republic. Anyway, the main assemblies were the Comitia Centuriata, also called the Assembly of the Centuries, the Comitia Tributa or the Assembly of the Tribes, and the Concilium Plebis or the Council of the Plebs. The Centuriate Assembly was organized by wealth and military class. It had 193 voting units, or centuries, each representing a group of 100 or so citizens. This assembly was mostly concerned with electing the consuls and declaring war. The tribal assembly was organized by geographic tribe and had 35 voting units or tribes. This assembly passed laws and elected lower magistrates such as aediles, quaestors, and censors. Finally, the plea council was reserved for plebeians only and elected the plebeian tribunes and passed laws known as plebiscite that initially had no legal authority but later gained it thanks to the plea council. So that's the basics of Roman elections. In addition to these major assemblies, Rome had several minor ones dealing with specific issues like appointing magistrates to special tasks. Now keep in mind that while the assemblies provided a way for the people to participate in government, voting power was weighted in favor of the wealthy since they had more property, paid higher taxes, and thus had more voting power. But still, this was an important step towards a more representative system of government. Okay, now that we've covered the big dogs and the pack, let's talk about the whole team, the group of officials known as magistrates whose job it was to run the day-to-day operations of the Roman Republic. There were a bunch of different types of magistrates, each with specific responsibilities. For example, praetors handled judicial matters, aediles managed public works, markets and festivals. Quaestors oversaw finances and censors conducted the census and maintained public morals. Magistrates were elected for fixed terms and were subject to public oversight. Also, most magistrates followed a formal ladder of offices called the cursus honorum, which provided a clear path to advancement. Starting at the bottom, the cursus honorum led to the consulship, the highest office in the state. The cursus honorum ensured that magistrates gained experience before taking on greater responsibilities. This approach helped maintain stability and continuity in government. And then there were the tribunes. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the tribunes were elected by the plebea at the behest of the plea council. They were considered sacred or sacrosanct, meaning any harm done to them was punishable by death. The tribunes were responsible for protecting the interests of the plebeians and defending them against the patricians. They could veto any act of the government, including those of the consuls and the Senate, and they could propose legislation to the tribal assembly. The tribunes were a key part of Rome's evolving efforts to balance the power of the elite with the rights of the people. So there you have it, a quick breakdown of the structure of the Roman Republic. Now, obviously, this wasn't the end of Roman history, but it is a good place to stop because this basic structure lasted for almost 500 years and formed the basis for many modern ideas about government. The Roman Republic was a pretty complicated system, but its basic principles were simple. Power should be shared, not held by one person. Leaders should be accountable to the people. And the people should have a say in how they are governed. These ideas are timeless and continue to inspire people around the world today. And hey, if you want to learn more about the crazy history of Rome or anything else, check out the learning resources. You know what? Go ahead and subscribe so you never miss an epic story. One of the best things about the Roman Republic was its focus on civic duty and service to the state. The idea that citizens had a responsibility to participate in government and work for the common good was a revolutionary idea in the ancient world, and it continues to be an important part of many modern democracies. But what was daily life like for ordinary Romans? How did they work, eat, play, and live? If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Don't forget to turn on your notifications to receive updates for more videos. Rome wasn't built in a day, but when it came to running an empire, the Romans sure put the concept of organization to the test. From a modest village of huts to the Mediterranean's dominant city-state and then an empire stretching from Britain to Egypt, Rome experimented with plenty of ways to govern. So how did it go? Well, let's find out. In this episode, we're going to look at how the Roman Empire went from republic to empire. How did the Roman Empire work? Let's get to it. The Roman Empire began in 27 BCE when Octavian was granted the title Augustus by the Roman Senate. Now, you might be more familiar with his other title, but today we're calling him Augustus because that's what he wanted to be called. Augustus didn't want to scare people off by appearing too much like a king. That said, Augustus also wasn't a fan of sharing power. In fact, he ruled Rome for the next 4 decades as its first emperor. But don't worry, he didn't abolish the Roman Senate or its associated institutions, such as the assemblies or the magistrates, which meant that in theory, Rome still operated under the guiding principles of the Republic. In practice, however, things were very different. Augustus kept many members of the Roman elite happy by leaving them in control of their property and allowing them to continue participating in Roman politics. However, he also made it clear that he was the one truly in charge. He cleverly used Augustus as a title that sounded very respectable but also merely denoted first citizen rather than king. And he promoted the idea that Rome was still run by the Senate. Yet it was clear that he, not the Senate, was the one appointing important officials and making key decisions. One of Augustus' greatest achievements was creating a highly competent and well-trained bureaucracy to replace the often corrupt officials of the late Republic. He also successfully instituted provincial governors who collected taxes and maintained order throughout the empire. In addition to centralizing power in his own hands, Augustus also laid down the foundation for Rome's new territorial divisions. The empire was split into 3 sections, those governed by imperial officials, those governed by senators, and client kingdoms which were allowed to maintain local rulers as long as they paid tribute to Rome. Another achievement of Augustus was the creation of the Praetorian Guard, an elite cohort of soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor. Originally numbering between 5,000 and 8,000 men, the Praetorian Guard lived in permanent barracks in Rome and were personally loyal only to the emperor. They were responsible for the safety of Augustus and his family, but they also quickly became a political tool. Over time, the Praetorian Guard grew in size and power until it became notorious for its ability to make or break emperors. So now that we've met Augustus, let's talk about the two main institutions of imperial Rome that remained from the Republic, the Senate and the Assemblies. The Roman Senate was a group of 600 elder statesmen whose role in the government was to advise and assist the magistrates. During the Republic, it was the most powerful institution, but after Augustus took power, the Senate's role became much less significant. That being said, it didn't disappear and it still served an important purpose. Augustus understood that Rome's prosperity relied on maintaining the goodwill of the Senate, so he often invited them to participate in public projects and celebrations. He also frequently consulted with them before making decisions, even though he ultimately made the final call. It's important to note that the Senate was also a source of legitimacy for the emperors. For example, the Senate voted to grant Augustus the title of Augustus, essentially giving him the title and power of king without actually breaking the laws against kingship in Rome. In the same way, when an emperor died, the Senate would vote to deify him, granting him the title of the divine, which helped ensure that the next emperor would have the Senate on their side. As for the assemblies, these were groups of citizens who gathered together to vote on important matters regarding the state, such as declaring war. During the Republic, the assemblies were a crucial part of the political process, but after Augustus took power, their importance declined as well. Like the Senate, however, they still existed and still served an important function. The assemblies formally ratified the laws that Augustus proposed and approved, giving him the appearance of operating within the bounds of the law. But what about the magistrates, the heads of the various branches of the Roman government, like consuls, praetors, and tribunes? What was their role in the empire? Under the Republic, the magistrates were elected officials who headed the various branches of government. The consuls, for example, were the chief executives of the state, while the praetors presided over courts. The tribunes, meanwhile, represented the common people and acted as their advocates within the government. However, as Augustus consolidated power, the role of these magistrates changed. Augustus was named consul in 27 BCE, but he never actually exercised the powers associated with the office. Instead, he delegated those powers to other members of the ruling class who were handpicked by him or by his successors. What this meant is that while the magistrates still existed and they still had all of the powers associated with their offices, they no longer had any real power. They were now simply figureheads who carried out the will of the emperor. The Roman Empire lasted for centuries, which means that there were lots of different emperors who implemented different policies and ideas. However, despite the differences between them, almost all the emperors were united in their goal of maintaining order and control throughout the empire. They achieved this in a number of ways, including investing in infrastructure projects, providing public services, and co-opting potential rivals. For example, Trajan, who reigned from 98 to 117 CE, was famous for building roads, aqueducts, and public buildings throughout the empire. He also established schools and libraries and sponsored public events. Meanwhile, Marcus Aurelius, who reigned from 161 to 180 CE, focused on maintaining order and stability. He worked to improve the legal code and he reformed the army. Both Trajan and Marcus Aurelius ruled according to the ideal of the benevolent autocrat, in which the emperor acts as a father figure to his people. However, not all emperors followed this model. Caligula, who reigned from 37 to 41 CE, was infamous for his extravagance and cruelty. Nero, who reigned from 54 to 68 CE, was another infamous ruler who persecuted Christians and wasted public money. These so-called bad emperors were eventually overthrown and replaced by more competent rulers. But their brief periods of power demonstrate the risks of unchecked authority. The later empire faced numerous challenges, including economic instability, barbarian invasions, and political turmoil. To address these issues, emperors like Diocletian and Constantine implemented a variety of reforms, including the introduction of a new currency, the reorganization of the army, and the construction of new capital cities. Despite these efforts, however, the empire was unable to avoid decline and eventually collapsed in the 5th century CE. While we haven't really talked about it yet, we can't forget about the Roman military, which played a crucial role in the development and maintenance of the Roman Empire. At its peak, the Roman military was one of the most powerful fighting forces in the ancient world. It was highly disciplined, well-organized, and equipped with advanced weaponry. The military was also incredibly diverse, with soldiers coming from all across the empire. The Roman army was divided into several branches, including the legionary army, the auxiliary troops, and the navy. The legionary army was the backbone of Rome's military might, consisting of professional soldiers who served for 25 years. Meanwhile, the auxiliary troops were recruited from conquered peoples and often served as support for the legionaries. The navy, meanwhile, was responsible for protecting Rome's vast coastline and its many trading ships. Despite its size and power, the Roman military was not immune to the problems that plagued the rest of the empire. In the 3rd century CE, the army faced a period of instability known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century. This was a time of civil war and economic decline, and it led to a drastic reduction in the size of the military. However, the army recovered under the reign of Diocletian, who implemented a number of reforms to stabilize the situation. So, to sum up, the Roman Empire was a complex and evolving entity that developed over centuries. While it was born out of the ashes of the Roman Republic, it was something entirely new. It was a centralized autocracy that was run by a single powerful ruler known as the emperor. The emperor was the supreme authority in the empire, holding absolute power over the military, the legal system, and the economy. While the emperor was at the center of the imperial government, he was not alone. He was assisted by a number of officials and institutions, including the Senate, the assemblies, and the bureaucracy. The Senate, while no longer the powerhouse it had been during the Republic, still had some influence over the emperor. The assemblies, meanwhile, were largely ceremonial, but they still served an important function in legitimizing the emperor's power. The bureaucracy, on the other hand, was the engine of the imperial government, keeping everything running smoothly and efficiently. Perhaps the most important aspect of the Roman Empire was its military, which was the backbone of Rome's power. The Roman military was highly trained and disciplined, and it was able to hold the empire together despite its vast size and diversity. Overall, the Roman Empire was a remarkable achievement in terms of its scope and longevity. Despite its many problems, it managed to endure for centuries, leaving behind a legacy that continues to influence the world today. So what do you think? Did the Roman Empire succeed or fail? Why? And how did the Roman Empire influence the world? Let us know in the comments. And if you liked this video, be sure to check out our other videos on ancient Rome. Thanks for watching.